Hi everyone, this is my little small project called Between Ideas and Subcultures, and I want to welcome my dear friend Marylia Hushcha here, um, who recently wrote an interesting paper about feminism and nuclear policy. Hi Marylia.
Hi, thanks for
Hi.
having me here.
And we know each other maybe for, yeah, well, over 8 years, maybe something like that. And maybe this is for the first time, right, that we speak in English. So it's a bit weird, but
We'll manage.
yeah. Oh, and yeah, I think we are still recording. Okay, great. Okay, so maybe this is a test run, so we can be more relaxed. But yeah, but it's quite interesting. But okay, you wrote your paper in English, and you are actually from Belarus, so we speak Slovak because well, you taught me Russian actually, like even formally a little bit. We are former co-workers and me and my another coworker Tanya, we were your students for a while, but from my side it was a bit of a fail because I didn't prepare myself well, right?
No, no. But it was fun. To me, it was always fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was great, but you taught me how to write Russian written alphabet, so
At least something.
yeah, you did something, so I can actually, yeah, and I need to progress because my what is it? The brother-in-law is Russian, right? So actually, there is this concept of a forcing function. So it's like uh, when you when you need to get to work early, that's a forcing function, like or actually on time, because otherwise you will be I don't know punished. So it's like a forcing function, but this is the same thing. Like my brother-in-law and my sister will move to Slovakia maybe at the end of the year, and so I need to learn at least some basic Russian because he doesn't speak English well. Anyhow, so yeah, so maybe I will I will let you speak, but maybe just to say that we were colleagues on this foundation. We focused on these international development projects and some other projects also in Slovakia with corporate social responsibility. And you studied something around like connected, or your topic of research is peace studies, if I'm correct, or something around peace. And now currently I'm working at the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. And you wrote something about feminism and nuclear policy, or some gender aspects of nuclear policy. And actually, the question, or the title of the article is like, "Might feminism revive arms control?" Question mark. Why greater inclusion of women in nuclear policy is necessary, and how to achieve it. So that's your title. And well, we discussed this article before when you were writing it, and then also shortly before. And well, I like lots of points there, but maybe I will just let you to maybe to talk a bit about yeah, like what is the idea behind it, or what you like, or what you learn from writing the article. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. So I just need to make this remark at the beginning while I'm saying that I'm speaking about nuclear policy. I mean basically nuclear weapons policy, since nuclear policy can be related also to nuclear energy and other sectors. But here we're speaking mostly about disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So basically, the idea of this paper was um, came out of a workshop that we at the International Institute for Peace organized with another NGO here in Vienna, which the aim of the workshop was to develop ideas about feminist foreign policy. And this all is happening also in the year 2020, which celebrates the 20th anniversary of a very important United Nations resolution on women, peace, and security. So the resolution was adopted by the United Nations Security Council, which for the first time basically acknowledged or like made it very visible the role that women play, especially in security, not generally in politics, but very specifically in peace talks, in security sector, and so on. And so since I also had some previous background on nuclear security, I decided that I will combine these two areas. So on one hand, we have permanent security, and then there is this field of nuclear disarmament and arms control, which in the recent years has been very. There were a lot of tensions, a lot of disagreements on, like on the UN level, so among negotiators from different countries. And there were also some other developments, bilateral developments between Russia and the US, multilaterally, the agreement with Iran, also between the US and North Korea. So lots of stuff which for now looks very grim. So many of these agreements are being collapsed, and there seems to be lack of progress on almost any front. So
yeah, I mean, currently we live through this COVID-19 pandemic, so we feel some very salient this notion of existential risks, like okay, maybe existential risks from some biological agents or pollution or even weapons, but nuclear policy has been here for decades, and actually people got maybe even too comfortable with like nothing much terrible happening. Even there were some close calls and some accidents and some standoffs like the Cuban missile crisis, etc. But it seems like humanity managed to escape this trouble. And there was actually also something positive recently. It was like in 2017, and there was this ICANN, if I'm correct, the abbreviation ICANN, I guess even. ICANN, and they got the Nobel Peace Prize, if I'm correct. And so this was maybe the positive. And you said that okay, this is the positive aspect of maybe one positive thing about in this area. But now currently it seems like the world is getting more and more polarized, and the multilateralism is like receding or has some problems, and on the other hand, populism and kind of nationalism is on the rise. But sorry, maybe this is too wide. But getting back to you and to maybe if you say something about this 2017 or what was the achievement?
Yeah, so no, you were very right about mentioning the adoption of this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which was on the one hand, it was of course very widely celebrated everywhere around the world already. Like I think at the assembly over 120 countries voted in favor of this treaty. Now there still needs a couple of more ratifications for the treaty to actually enter into force. But what's sort of the sad part of this whole initiative, how this treaty was actually developed and came into being, was not that much that like everyone around the world was always like willing to create something like this, and then finally they did it. But it was more out of frustration of those countries that already like were pointing for very, very many years that those states that possess nuclear weapons, and that under another the probably most important international treaty on nuclear weapons, those nuclear weapon states, they did commit to disarmament, but they have never done that. And in the recent years, actually, the opposite has been happening. Their nuclear weapons programs have been modernized. They created more sophisticated weapons. They created more targeted weapons. So it's not really that they're growing their nuclear arsenals, but the arms race now is not about having more weapons, but having them more sophisticated. So this is a little bit, so that was kind of the opposition towards this trend, the creation of the treaty itself. But of course, at the same time, it also, like, by just being there, it establishes an international norm, a norm that was never there before. So there are three types of weapons of mass destruction. Those are biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. And for biological and chemical weapons, there already has been some sort of a legal prohibition of the use of those weapons. And for nuclear weapons, there was never anything like that. And now finally there is such a document. The question is only how long will it take for this norm to become that strong that states who already now have nuclear weapons give them up?
Cool. So I just like to make the some the topic is quite urgent and quite important. If we may borrow the effective altruism language, like of neglected, important, and urgent. So like, okay, it's also quite neglected because it's like business. Well, it's kind of an old business of nuclear disarmament, or this kind of like going back to the 60s, right? Some peace protest. But currently, it seems like in this multipolar world, it's getting to, the situation is actually maybe worse than people realize, like security-wise. But getting back to your topic of like, or some meta topic of seeing the nuclear weapons or security policy from the viewpoint, or connecting it to the topic of gender or feminism. So, what I remember from your article, like there were several interesting topics, or points that I took. One was that, okay, it's kind of perceived that these like weapon systems is like something like hard security, and then there is this concept of soft security, of let's say some country branding and some indirect kind of building of goodwill between different players, and kind of like projecting some soft power through, let's say, different types of cooperations, or let's say through culture. And so women are more kind of these masculine versus feminism, feminine like aspects are also played here in this kind of like hard security versus soft security, if I'm correct, or if I remember it well from your article. So
That's very because it's sort of complicated and maybe even a little bit controversial. So on one hand, you have hard security, which is traditionally understood as military security, so weapon systems, all sort of defense, the army and all this stuff, military. And then you have soft security, which is understood as this something which is also called like more feminist approaches, sort of looking into on the individual level, looking into like environmental risks, looking into human security. So we aren't focusing on something as we understand it, national state interest, but we look into individual interest, sort of. So every individual wants to live in a healthy and have access to medical services and so forth. And so this is basically the debate around nuclear weapons, or at least those nuclear weapons abolitionists. That's what they're suggesting. They're suggesting to refocus the debate, understanding of nuclear weapons as something important for national security, towards how they're actually detrimental to every single person's individual security, so to say. Even security of those who are actually in charge of those weapons, and who actually would then, in some potential war scenario, would push the button that would deploy. So yeah, and when you mention actually this neglected importance, I wouldn't say that nuclear weapons are neglected. So there's sort of is like on the international level, or on the security establishment of those states, those weapons, there is this very like present understanding that they are like very important, but this importance understood in terms of how they are important for our military, how they're important for our defense, capabilities, but not in terms of how bad it can all end. If something happens, intentionally or unintentionally. You also previously mentioned even missile crisis, but there were actually numerous accidents that happened around nuclear weapons in different parts of the world that were like, it was very close to to a big disaster, but somehow, yes, they were averted or prevented. So yeah, but again, like, the longer you wait statistically, right, the probability rises that something will happen. The longer something doesn't happen, uh, like the more likely it is to happen in the
Yeah,
future.
yeah. It's like playing. It's also kind of interesting, like these close calls and these almost like near accidents actually can keep us alert, and maybe they in a way or paradoxically can like keep us alert, and in this way like maybe make us more protected. But since nothing like that happened for a long time, maybe people get more complacent. I guess also similar could be with something like we haven't experienced such pandemic as now, maybe since the 60s, in some Hong Kong flu, or
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
maybe if I can add, because we again like started speaking more about nuclear weapons than like moved away from what role women can play in that. So what I also need to emphasize is that so it's not only so the point is not only to include women to disarm, in nuclear disarm. If you look at national states where there are nuclear weapons, even in this nuclear weapon field, in that particular state, there is very few women that are present there. And of course, who do the job in the military around nuclear weapons, they aren't there to disarm, or most of them, like since until nuclear weapons remain like as a core of national security posture, national security policy. So, but I, in my paper, also argue that women should be included on all levels, also in this nuclear security, um, establishment that actually, develops or maintains all this war planning exercises and so on. Why? Because simply there are many reasons why women should be included in any sphere, and the most simple of them is representation argument, that there are like 50-50% population on Earth or in any other country, and so like any issue that concerns women and men to an equal extent, women and men should be represented and they should have a say. Yeah, but
also you mentioned another argument. It's like women and men are affected by even like nuclear radiation, but meaning even like some disasters like Chernobyl or something differently because of biology.
Yeah.
Maybe you can. There were some interesting examples in your paper. I don't know, with something like some islands and some tribes or some people who live there, they eat different parts of fish, and maybe when the fish is exposed to radiation, so it's even like in such a like down to earth practical matters, but even in some more kind of traumas or stereotypes, or like kind of many issues connected to giving birth and like being pregnant after some disaster happens or something like that. So yeah, maybe.
Yeah, so the studies that were conducted about the impact of ionizing radiation that's released as a result of a detonation of a nuclear weapon, or as a result of any nuclear explosion. So when Chernobyl accident happened in Ukraine in 1986, it was also a nuclear explosion, and that also affected people in the long term. So here, like to see the different impact of radiation on women and men, we should take the long term, because in the short term, everyone is affected and it's horrible for anyone. In the long term, there was a study of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing of 1945. That was the only time when a nuclear weapon was actually used in conflict. So there, over a long term, women were, as it was shown in the paper, were twice as likely to develop cancer than men.
Mhm. Which is
That was
a huge difference, actually. Yeah.
a big difference, yes. Uh, and then another point was that through their social standing, they were also, or their roles, biological roles also, they were stigmatized, as it was thought that they will not be able to give birth to healthy children after being operated. So yeah, and then there are other examples of how different eating habits also affect um, women and men differently. There is a very, I found it fascinating example of local communities on the Marshall Islands where the United States used to test a lot their weapons, nuclear weapons. And so it was found that women traditionally eat different parts of meat than men. So we eat bones and organ meat, which usually accumulates this radiation more. So by this, they're exposed. And on the other hand, men, for example, in a region of Russia, which was also affected by Chernobyl severely, they were exposed to radiation since they ate more forest mushrooms and fish from lakes in that region. So
Okay.
yeah, that's.
Yeah, these like this was quite fascinating. They like these really well practical or examples, specific examples from around the world. Maybe we can just jump to another topic where there was something like creative adaptation. I think isn't correct. Am I correct? Like there is like one term like where maybe also women can like the benefit can be tangible beyond the representation argument, like 50-50 argument, or beyond the, well, it's not like skin in the game, but like since women are affected or indigenous populations are affected, so they should be also present in that decision making. So maybe the third argument is also some kind of like lateral thinking or more creative thinking or like creative adaptation. Maybe if you can explain it. And I don't know if when we will be cut off, but just like I don't know.
Yeah, well, more generally, the argument is about diversity.
Mhm.
So it's already common knowledge that more diverse groups make smarter decisions. They're also more effective and they're more creative in their work. If you look at the nuclear field on the international level, at the UN negotiations, or also on the level of states that possess those weapons, or also in these expert communities, in these circles of analysts and researchers, it's mostly men. And it's even more older white men. So one of the problems is that there is too few young people in the field. Before you gather necessary expertise, so you are recognized as a person sort of worth talking to. You already become old because so much is required to know. You need to know all the history. You need to know all the technical aspects of a weapon and stuff like that. And on the other side, when you're like as a fresh young person come up with new ideas, they aren't that much appreciated. So the field in itself is very conservative. And so that's why it's not diverse enough. And women are also not represented there. And so it's not only about more women being included in the field, it's also about more young people being included in the field. It's also about indigenous communities being included there because they are, as you mentioned, are very much affected.
By the nuclear tests, if it's not maybe like the connection for other people might not be relevant, but because of the nuclear tests are done on some kind of atolls or islands and somewhere in Pacific. So
but if speaking more specifically about women, you mentioned this concept, adaptive creativity. I think it was.
Sorry, yes, so not creative adaptation, but adaptive creativity. Okay.
Yeah, this is something that I would maybe like to look into more specifically. I didn't really make a lot of research on that, but the idea is that women are very good at a very specific type of creativity, which is this adaptive creativity, which means that they are good at uh, building upon something. So you have some structure which needs to be reorganized, which needs to be reshaped or optimized, and women can do that very well for sorts of reasons that I would like maybe to research more in future. Yeah, but this is what their advantage might be, but at the same time, again coming back to this representation argument, it's not about that women have to have some sort of advantage or they have to be somehow useful to be included in the field. It's just they're right. This is the most basic argument. They have to be included. They are just part of the world, like, so that's why they must.
Yeah, but this is also this third argument of creative adaptive creativity is also, it's quite interesting as well, because it's you said like when you do some optimization, so maybe like women can do it more holistically, maybe, I don't know if I get it well, or they can see more connections, like they perceive maybe complexity better than men. That's my kind of like what I kind of observe or what I read, but I also need to look at it more carefully.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to look in terms of how things are negotiated. So for now, let's leave aside all these technical aspects of weapons, which is important to some degree, but at the same time, if your goal is to actually get rid of weapons, you first need to, like figure out the strategy how to do that, like together with others who are also doing that, because it's all like an interconnected system. One will not disarm while others are rearming or something like that. So, and here what is important the most is the negotiation process. I can give you some statistics from some other area, which mainly peace building. In peace building, it was already researched very well and already proven that when women are included in the peace process, the negotiation agreements that are concluded at the end are much more sustainable. They last longer and they're more inclusive. So again, it's not to say that women are peaceful and that's why they're better at peace process. It's because they're also a big part of the society, and when a bigger part of the society is included into the negotiation process, that means that there is more representation, and that means that there is more consensus in the society about something. So here again, and again, like to give you a specific example of how women actually have negotiated nuclear agreements, a very now actually quite popular example to refer to is the Iran nuclear deal, where three women from the European Union and a woman from the United States were at the core of the negotiation process. So Catherine Ashton, Federica Mogherini, who were successive high representatives of the European Union for external affairs, and then their advisor Helga Schmidt, who was actually like the contact person for all other parties more or less, and she negotiated the agreement itself, the wording, the text of it. And on the U.S. side, it was Wendy Sherman, later on under Secretary of State of the U.S. So she was on John Kerry's team during the negotiations, and she was like also one of the main persons in the process. And so there was an agreement which actually was concluded. It was also sort of a breakthrough. I mean, a unique agreement in some ways, but again, unfortunately, it's now not really functioning.
Now it's falling apart, right? Or yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. Especially like, yeah, I mean, last time we spoke also about this like well, adaptive creativity, that it's like something like well, that I'm interested in complexity as well. I'm still just learning, getting some ideas, forgetting some ideas, but this idea of adaptive creativity or creative adaptation is something that kind of reminds me of is another term I recently learned. It's like exaptation. So it's like using, let's say, one thing very creatively in another context. So, like for example, microwave came out. Dave Snowden, he explains it like the microwave was invented by one guy who noticed that his Hershey bar got melted when he was standing at some radar, some kind of military equipment or something with some waves, and so chocolate melted in his pocket, and he kind of 10 years later the microwave was on the market or something. So like creative adaptation, but maybe it's kind of like not the opposite of adaptation, but a reframing of adaptation. And so I think this is also necessary in this area of like soft security versus hard security, or like thinking about those kind of terms, but maybe creatively and reframing them somehow. Like so I don't know what do you think about it, but I feel I feel hope when when these kind of topics, like when the diversity of opinions and of experiences is greater, I'm kind of more hopeful that we can escape some kind of stalemate or some kind of impasse and break into like a open future or definite future and come up with some innovation.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I also very much like the idea of using something in some other context and coming up with something new. This is great. This is how, I don't know, social entrepreneurship works, right? Lots of projects of this sort. But what is necessary on the international level to, of course, there can be, as I mentioned before, in the nuclear field, it's quite conservative in terms of how it works, how the mindsets are, and everything. So there might be creative ideas, but first problem is that they might not be heard, and second problem, even if they're heard, they might not be listened to. So here, what I would say, like, but it's like an endemic problem, it's like, as long as I've been, like somehow following this nuclear discussion, it was like always there, this idea of lack of political will. So unless there is really, a willingness to do something about it, to change things, then I mean, you can of course indirectly influence it through civil society movements, through more discussions about it, conferences, research, and everything. But unless the leaders really realize that it's necessary to move in the direction to the world without nuclear weapons, if we're speaking about disarmament, happen. And unless leaders in countries realize that more women should be included in policy making, there won't be more women there. So there are some steps made, but it's a very slow process. I'm not pessimistic about it. A lot has been done, but again, there are still some pitfalls.
Concerning this topic of catastrophic risks or existential risks, like, okay, this effective altruism movement is talking about it for a couple of years now. I'm following also this like game B kind of topic or people around it. And they also even talk about something like meta existential risks, like rivalry being one, or some exploitation of resources, excessive extraction and pollution, like another problem, and then exponential technology as a third, like meta existential risk. But generally, maybe people were not really that sensitive, or it wasn't so salient to mainstream or majority of people and voters, and therefore maybe even politicians didn't think about these topics like catastrophic risks that much. But I think also this pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic, could change it, because it's maybe for the first time ever that humanity was united like globally, like by one event, like it's like people in Nairobi or in some small villages, let's say in Kenya, were quarantined, people in New York, people in Bratislava or Vienna, we are all kind of experiencing the same event, and so it's kind of like on a planetary scale, we got united somehow. So I feel this topic of existential risks or catastrophic risks, which is like a level below existential risks, becomes more salient, more important, like, or accessible to mainstream consciousness or public consciousness. And as you say, and you argue well in your paper several times, women play an important role in nurturing this topic further, or like actually even breaking away from like this impasse or this stalemate, or how to call it. Yeah, and you mentioned like, okay, the representation argument that women are like 50% of the population, why they should be also represented more in this important area of nuclear weapons control and nuclear safety, weapons safety. And then you also mentioned, well, the second, well, I like the creative adaptation or adaptive creativity argument. And then there was another one, yeah, that the women are affected maybe in some respects or many, some dimensions more or much more, even like twice as much as men concerning cancer, according to some of the sources that you mentioned. So I don't know, maybe yeah, I mean, we discussed these topics from, I don't know, from meditation and Buddhism to effective altruism, or just like to anything that we read. I know that I didn't still have time to watch those series of Sapolsky, is it, that you want that you want to discuss maybe next time? But concerning this important topic of nuclear weapons safety and the women in this area, maybe what else do you want to talk about, or tell us?
Yeah, I might then maybe encourage the listeners to check out the very specific recommendations that I make in the paper, but okay. I guess those recommendations will be also very much for organizations and the governments. And one very recommendations for any civil society organization or prominent individuals would be to join this initiative. It's called the International Gender Champions. A very cool initiative that actually promotes higher participation of women in all areas, generally in policy making and foreign policy, but they also have a specific cluster on disarmament. And this initiative unites heads of organizations, of international organizations, of society organizations, of governments, and so on. And those people make very specific, so those people who represent organizations, as organizations, they make specific pledges how they specifically can contribute and how they commit to contribute to this issue. I find it very practical because exactly you can see the progress. Sometimes we're just lacking this sense of having moved somewhere. There is, as I said, there is this movement, there is some progress, but it's very slow. And just even for the sake of the good feeling, you need to measure it to see how things are and how they are changing. Yeah, so I mean, it's quite a new initiative, so still we will see what will come out of it. But so far, I think that's one of the very few, very specific things that I found are done in this field.
Yeah, we should put it in the link, so also your paper and maybe this recommendation, or maybe just your paper so they read it at the end.
Yeah, great.
yeah. So thank you. Maybe I just like it's gonna be 1 hour soon, and I don't know when we will be cut off or something. So I think we should.
Oh,
yeah.
Are we? Yeah.
It's still recording. It's still recording.
Because, okay, I think we can finish here.
Okay.
And now we can switch to Slovak.
All right. So thank you, Marylia, for your for talking
Yeah.
to me and to discussing your paper a bit. And I think we could discuss some loads of issues, some other kind of like concerning complexity and biology and Buddhism and anything starting with B, like game B or effective altruism. Okay. Thank you and take care. Yeah.
Thank you too.
Take care. Bye. Thanks.
Kubo.